Hi all, for those of you that don't know, I'm Cressida Hall, I'm the General Manager of AIMA, and I'd like to welcome you all tonight to this webinar. We're really privileged to have four completely eminent doctors, herbalists, naturopaths to come and give us their knowledge and wisdom. So thank you to all the panellists. I'd like to make a little announcement about next week's webinar. We're going to follow a slightly different format next week. It will be held on Tuesday at 4:30 p.m. in New South Wales, 6:30 in New Zealand. This will be a webinar on demand, so if you sign up for it, you can watch it whenever you like within about the period of about 2 weeks. We're thrilled that we're going to have Jimmy Wollomben talking with us. He's the founder of One Health organisation, and he's going to be talking some really big picture things with us about seeing the current crisis as an invitation to change and what that could look like, what we can do, and how we can come together as a community to help make sure that that change includes integrative medicine and holistic health. So I'm going to hand over now to Professor Stephen Myers, who's going to be leading this discussion, and I am going to hand over to him right now. So thank you. Bye.
Great, thanks, Cressida. I'm one of four members of this panel. I'm the fossilised male with three very awesome female presenters who are going to actually give you an overview, or we're all going to give you an overview of naturopathic and herbal approaches. So the first thing we're going to do, and I think that this is going to actually become part of what occurs on a regular basis in the AIMA seminars, is to just actually give you a bit of a COVID-19 update. What's actually happened since last week that's worthwhile coming to understand. So the first thing is that the antiviral drug...
clever thing there.
Sorry, we need to mute somebody. The antiviral drug that has been considered to be beneficial, there was a study published in the New England Journal of Medicine that came out at the beginning of the month that showed that there was a 68% improvement. I think importantly, there's an editorial in the British Medical Journal that says, okay, it's a drug with potential, but don't waste time on uncontrolled observations. This morning, Dr. Fauci teased us with data from a new trial for 1,000 severely ill patients in 75 hospitals that showed very rapid recovery. We're yet to actually see that. As of this morning, it certainly was unpublished. So we're looking forward to actually see whether there is a antiviral that can potentially be beneficial, especially in severe cases. The other thing that's hitting the news at the moment is COVID-19 in children. There's an international cluster of cases that have been associated with very severe inflammatory disease, conditions like Kawasaki disease. And the data, I guess, is now being internationally collected, and we'll see a more systematic evidence-based update on that sometime in the near future. One of the things that has happened in the last week is that a series of 2,135 children have been published from China. One of the things about that particular cohort is 13% were confirmed having asymptomatic infections, and the authors consider this understates the true rate of asymptomatic infection, since many asymptomatic children are very unlikely to actually have been tested. And I think that that's the case across the board, where actually the cases that we have tested represent a component of the amount of individuals that have been exposed and have the disease in the community. Among the symptomatic children, 5% had shortness of breath or hypoxia. That's a lower percentage than we see in adult population, and less than 1% progressed to acute respiratory distress syndrome, or this multi-organ system dysfunction that's now actually being investigated. What they did note was that preschool age children and infants were more likely to have severe clinical manifestations than older children. We also know a little bit more about the virus and what it's actually doing. This is a paper that was actually published today in the New England Journal of Medicine. And what it's actually pointing out is that the spike protein on the SARS-CoV-2 or CoV-2 attaches to the ACE2 receptor, and it uses that mechanism for viral entry and replication within the cells. One of the things that it does do is that it actually leads to ACE2 receptor downregulation. And part of the problem associated with that is, if you look at the ACE2 receptor and the green line that comes from it, is that angiotensin converting enzyme converts angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 is the very potent vasoconstricting agent, and one of the reasons why we use ACE inhibitors to be able to prevent hypertension. ACE2, angiotensin converting enzyme 2, actually converts angiotensin 2 into angiotensin 1,7, which is a balancing regulatory molecule which actually has a vasodilatory effect, and also converts angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 1 and 9. And angiotensin 1 and 9 can prevent the heart from remodeling under significant stress. So what they think is actually happening is, as the angiotensin 2 converting enzyme receptor is downregulated, we're getting unopposed angiotensin 2 being produced. And this is believed to actually be the cause of the acute lung injury, myocardial remodeling, massive vasoconstriction, and vascular permeability. I caught a webinar put on by the Royal Society of Medicine with an intensivist last week, who said that they were actually seeing a lot of vascular problems in their patients with increased vascular coagulation. Interestingly enough, on the right side of this slide is an observation from another study published very recently, which was a small study on 12 patients, but they actually evaluated clinical and biochemical indices and found that increased angiotensin 2 was markedly elevated and linearly associated with the viral load and lung injury. So the two things are correlated. The authors of this paper have recommended that we be very careful in removing or stopping ACE inhibitors, especially from individuals who've been given them post-myocardial infarcts. Basically, they say among patients with unstable clinical status, myocardial injury associated with COVID-19 may pose even greater or higher early risks after withdrawal of the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system inhibitors. They actually came up with a series of key points, and these slides will be available after for people to review. But I think the last thing on the bottom is what I want to point out. Until further data is available, we think that RAS inhibitors, and that includes ACE inhibitors, should be continued in patients in otherwise stable condition who are at risk for or being evaluated for or with COVID-19. And I think that that's a new piece of information that certainly those in the medical community need to be aware of. So I'm going to set a broader stage for my co-speakers. I just wanted to start off by talking about a postulate that actually just literally came out last week in the American Journal of Physiology, which suggested that there might be an opposite pull between resveratrol and dietary fat. They noted that resveratrol upregulates ACE2 receptors in animal studies, and it may be that we do need upregulation of ACE2 receptors, and that dietary fat downregulates ACE2 receptors. And they postulate the biological plausibility of an interaction between these two, that individuals who don't have lots of berries and grapes and dark chocolate in their diet probably have lots more dietary fat and are eating that sort of very standard diet, which may actually not be a good thing to be doing. And certainly dietary fat consumption is something we need to be aware of, especially high levels of saturated fat is something that we should be aware of and communicating to people to be very cautious about during this particular period. One of the things that our panel did before we actually talked was to have a discussion about this precautionary principle of primum non nocere, first do no harm. And in a very interesting paper that's available online on integrative considerations during the COVID-19 pandemic, Lee Alschuler, Andy Weil and others actually state there's a high level of interest in integrative strategies, but unfortunately no integrative measures have been validated in human trials as effective specifically for COVID-19. And the bolding was included in the paper to make sure that we actually understand what they were writing about, but what we're going to be talking about is a general approach to dealing with viral infections from a naturopathic point of view and a herbal point of view without any specific data about COVID-19. And I think that that's actually an exceedingly important caveat in terms of understanding what we're about to communicate. So the naturopathic approach primarily begins with the healing power of nature, the vis meta-axis, nature A, and we could probably talk for the rest of the hour about how that can actually be applied. But the importance of natural exposures in terms of things like sunlight, clean water, clean air, and clean food are extremely important components of that. We need to identify and treat the underlying causes. And one of the things that's been a significant discussion during this particular period of time are the socioeconomic determinants of health. Some of those things are actually exceedingly difficult to treat and virtually impossible on an individual basis, but it's something that we as healthcare providers need to consider in terms of the wider community discussion that happens. You're probably all aware of the increased incidence in African Americans who generally have poorer socioeconomic circumstances than their white counterparts. And those things need to actually be dealt with at a fundamental societal level. Obviously, prevention and ensuring that we prevent ourselves from being exposed, and that's what social distancing and washing our hands is about, is much better than dealing with the disease once we've got it. And Ren is going to actually talk about barrier immunity and how important that actually is. We then need to individualize our treatment to treat the whole person and to apply what we call the therapeutic order. This paper is available online, and it talks about a very important concept in naturopathic medicine. And basically the therapeutic order goes back to the fundamental of do no harm, but start out with minimal treatment. And again, we could talk for a long time on this, but the primary purpose of this is we need to establish the conditions for health. And in dealing with anyone who's at risk for this virus, we need to actually look at what those determinants of health are and make sure that this individual is doing everything that they can from a lifestyle point of view and things under their own control to maximize their own health. We can then stimulate the vis meta-axis, nature A, and our own self-healing processes. And we do that through things like exercise, by good sleep, by things like saunas. And Joanna Harnett is going to actually talk somewhat about this particular level of the naturopathic therapeutic order. We then need to support and balance our normal physiological and bioenergetic systems, which means that we fundamentally need to actually get a good diet, and we need to actually be free of major stresses. You know, stresses are fundamental in our lives, but as long as it remains new stress and not distress, we can actually deal with it. But we need to have a balanced state of being, and there are multiple factors, obviously, that play a role in that. The osteopaths among us and believe that function follows structure, and the next level of the hierarchy is to address or correct structural integrity to make sure that the individual is appropriately aligned. The next level is to address pathology using specific natural substances, and that's where we start to prescribe herbs and nutrients. The next level is to address the pathology using prescription drugs primarily, and then we can actually look at suppressing what's actually happening by providing fairly significant agents like, methotrexate or corticosteroids, or by surgical removal of particular organs if that's required. None of those things are inappropriate, and every individual has to start at some point that's appropriate for them within this therapeutic hierarchy. I want to point out a couple of things that certainly I'm aware of and that I'm actually including in my diet at the moment that you may or may not be aware of, and beetroot is one of those. Beetroot plays a role in increasing the elevated nitric oxide in healthy individuals. Nitric oxide is important in regard to the innate immune response. We know, interestingly enough, that just the simple act of yawning can actually increase our salivary IgA. Our body is actually prepared when we actually expose our surfaces to be able to come into play. And when we actually exercise, one of the things that actually happens is our innate immunity is actually significantly enhanced. And beetroot will actually increase our nitric oxide at the level of the lung. And one of the things that was actually found, and in the bottom study where they did a proof of concept, was that higher exhaled nitric oxide was concurrently and prospectively associated with reduced respiratory symptomology. Beetroot is one of those, I think, from my perspective, quintessential Australian foods that you can't have a veggie burger or a burger without a slice of beetroot. I always had beetroot in salads when I was growing up, so it's always been part of my diet. But I'd recommend for those of you who are not big beetroot eaters or don't think of beetroot to start increasing your exposure to beetroot. Baker's yeast, or savoury yeast flakes as they're actually known in health food shops, contain beta-glucan. And there's no doubt that beta-glucan can have immune stimulatory properties, but importantly, it's been shown to reduce upper respiratory tract symptoms and improve mood in women, and also to increase salivary IgA and reduce cold and flu symptoms post-exercise. And one of the things that we'll find out in Joanna's talk is that there is a modicum of exercise that's beneficial, and then too much is probably too much. So some of the foods to consume at the moment are foods rich in quercetin, onions and apples, those rich in anthocyanins, berries, red onions, red grapes and purple carrots, those rich in vitamin C, and those rich in zinc. All of those substances are going to be beneficial in terms of actually preparing the body to be able to both repel and deal with viral pathogens. Aromatics such as garlic, ginger and turmeric are important things to consume in the diet. They have anti-inflammatory properties, they have anticoagulant properties, and those things are going to actually be beneficial both in prevention and during the course of a COVID-19 infection. Primarily, we need to actually look at a diet that has an abundance of fruits and vegetables, and I think that that's actually fairly clear is the diet that we all need to be on to be able to significantly reduce 80% of chronic diseases. Funnily enough, research is finding that people who are in social isolation are consuming significantly more alcohol, and alcohol has a dampening effect on immune function and obviously is toxic to many organ systems, while there's probably that classic sort of French paradox. But as we actually analysed the data, there was an important study reported last year that was done in the United Kingdom that actually suggested the amount of alcohol we should consume is actually much lower than we actually believed. Vitamin D. This is a paper that was actually published very, very late in March, and suggests that vitamin D supplementation could reduce risk of influenza and COVID-19 infections. Obviously, our sun exposure is a very important component of our well-being, and the use of supplemental vitamin D is very appropriate in the preventative stage and possibly in early infection, though there is some concern that it may actually contribute to cytokine storm. Having said that, the last thing I wanted to talk about is things to consider avoiding. And this is a list that's actually comes from the Altschuler paper, that at the time when an individual is under severe threat of COVID-19, this group has recommended that we look at avoiding things like elderberry, polysaccharides from medicinal mushrooms, echinacea species, larch, and vitamin D, because of the fact that they've been shown to increase interleukin 1b or interleukin 18 production. Both are important in the development of a cytokine storm. We can probably talk about a lot of those topics in a lot more detail, and maybe we'll get an opportunity to do that in a later webinar. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague Renee Dubois to talk about barrier immunity. Ren.
Hello, Stephen. Thank you. Have you got me there?
I do.
Okay, great. Let me see. So I've obviously had a lot of patients contact me and ask, what can I do to prevent or to fortify myself from getting coronavirus? And it really has depended, primarily I've had to go back to the basics of the immunity, which is the barrier immunity. And but then I got swamped with all of these patients asking me, what can I give my family? What can I send my grandparents? What can I give my kids? And a lot of information went around andrographis. And I wasn't confident for families to just willy-nilly prescribe andrographis to their family members. So I had to pull it right back to the basics. And when you go back to the basics, our best frontline defense are our barriers. And so it feels like it's worthwhile looking at them. I don't know if the PowerPoint's coming up, Stephen. I think a few people were saying that they weren't getting the PowerPoint. I don't know, in the chat.
Oh.
But let me close that off. The barrier, that frontline innate immune response, it's you know, it's the tears, it's our skin is a beautiful barrier, our saliva, which protects the mucous membrane, our stomach acids are a beautiful barrier. That in the large intestines, the microbiota and that beautiful loose mucus on the top, which the secretory IgA mount that frontline defense. If all of these barriers are intact and the mucous membrane of the lungs, that epithelial layer, if those barriers are intact, it seems like we've got a better frontline defense. So rather than having to fight the virus, if we can just create those barriers so that the virus doesn't penetrate initially, we're doing much better. And it's why we're using full masks and face masks to try and prevent ourselves from ingesting or inhaling these. Skin hand washing has shown 50% reduction. So these are really simple lifestyle stuff that we can do. But then my patients that I know have leaky gut, I'm going to work a lot harder on those patients to get their secretory IgA up. And there's some really simple things that I'm really comfortable to use across the board that I'm not so worried about, that have less side effects. So the main herbs that I've been using that I'm really comfortable to use are herbs like calendula, and it's a very gentle herb. All of these herbs do have some antibacterial and antiviral components, but I'm not using them specifically for that. We've got bigger guns for that. So these herbs I'm using more just to protect the barrier. Echinacea I do like using, although Stephen, you read that study that suggested not to use it if you do have COVID. Pre-COVID, it's an excellent silagogue. So if those patients that have really dry mouths, it just really helps with that salivary production. Marshmallow root, I really like. It's a beautiful demulcent and emollient. It has that beautiful lining, soothing effect of that barrier immunity, as does slippery elm. One of my personal favourites is fenugreek. It's such a gentle herb. You can give it to pregnant women, children, and it has that beautiful demulcent effect, but it works in the respiratory system, it works in the gut. It really balances out the mucous membrane integrity. Elderberry made my list, but there's been a lot of press around elderberry and that cytokine storm, but it is a beautiful immune modulator pre-getting COVID. Eyebright is another beautiful mucous membrane tonic, and withania and pelargonium I really like as well. They're just nourishing herbs that are immune modulating. And so my frontline herbs aren't herbs like andrographis and olive leaf. I'd be using those herbs more if you get a flu-like picture. So for barrier immunity, nutrients, vitamin A, although I wouldn't take that one long term, maybe once a week, but I prefer to use its counterpart, the beta-carotene, which is a vitamin A precursor and a lot safer to use. There's a lot of beautiful foods that are really high in beta-carotene, and it really supports that mucous membrane immunity. Vitamin C, I've noticed a few questions coming through. It's really safe to use in small amounts, and small amounts frequently. We know about bowel tolerance. So, you know, if somebody's getting diarrhea, the gut does get agitated by vitamin C. It's not a great delivery. And that's why for larger doses, intravenous is really well tolerated and is fantastic if you need to get a larger dose when you're under viral load. But pre-viral load, and to prevent that viral load from becoming a problem, the small amounts regularly. Zinc is a classic one for that structural integrity. Quercetin, there's been a lot of talk about, but one of the things it really does is it improves that GIT integrity. You do have to be careful with doses, and there are some contraindications with quercetin. And then the last two that I want to mention is the Saccharomyces boulardii and lactoferrin, both supporting with that secretory IgA integrity and that frontline immune defense. And I think if we've got these defenses in place prior, we're going to have a lot better chance, if we do contract COVID, to then move into the herbs like andrographis, which there's been a lot around. There's two other papers that I popped in just because I'm doing lots of research around this. There was an article in Science Direct just looking at the different herbs and their mechanisms of action. It's a good paper. I didn't put them all up here, but andrographis, its mechanism of action is suppression. Mind you, just reiterating, Stephen, what you said, that you know, we don't really know. There's not been any tests done for herbs in COVID. So we're just attempting to apply the knowledge we have with other COVID counterparts. What we do know is this one's slightly different. And I'll just go to that next slide, in that the spike proteins on the coronavirus that we have are these furons, and they're on the spike of the protein as opposed to the body of the protein, which the other COVID cousins have. And so this spike furin gives the virus diplomatic immunity. And what it seems is it can enter the cell quite easily. And so when I'm looking through and I'm trying to find furon inhibitors, what we come back to is the flavonoids, the polyphenols, quercetin. Again, there was 2 studies that I found done on mice with L-arginine and L-lysine. And what we know with these substances is they do help with that nitric oxide production. So we're still getting the big picture. We know this condition does have a metabolic flavor once you do get it, but it's really hard. We're speculating from here on in what are the best herbs to use and what are the best actions that we should be inhibiting or supporting. So yeah, I hope that's helpful.
Fantastic, thanks Ren. Joanna, would you like to come online?
Yes, so good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us tonight. I've taken an even more conservative approach than the word prevention, because even that is controversial at the moment when we're talking about the pandemic that we are all living through, to taking a broader approach and talking about health promoting behaviours. And often I think naturopathy is criticised as not being evidence-based. However, when we actually look at the evidence for some of these health promoting behaviours, particularly one of the fundamental topics that is talked about in naturopathic practice and by many clinicians is sleep. So I just wanted to share with you, I have a PhD student at the moment, Vipa Malhotra, and she is looking at naturopathic approaches to sleep disorders. And when she surveyed, was actually a representative sample of Australian naturopaths that we're currently waiting to be published in behavioural sleep medicine. She found that naturopaths spent a substantial amount of time in their practice talking about sleep for a range of disorders, including immunity and other chronic disease states such as cardiovascular disease, some of the cancers, and many mental health conditions. So what I want to share with you just now is some of the evidence base around what we know around sleep and immunity. And we know that circadian rhythms play a role in mediating both innate and adaptive immune responses through their influence on our leukocyte movement and chemotaxis, around the T cell differentiation that is really important to occur to get a balance between our T helper 1 and T helper 2 responses. It's involved in our cytokine release and also antibody development. And so we know it's this bidirectional effect that when somebody has poor sleep, they are predisposed to infection and a pro-inflammatory state occurs. And vice versa, when people are infected, it causes a pro-inflammatory state that actually disrupts the sleep patterns. We also know that short or habitual sleep, which is defined as less than 6 hours per night of quality sleep, is also associated with a susceptibility to viral infections and also a reduction in the antibody titers after exposure to a vaccine. That particular study was actually looking at a Hep B vaccine. And we also know that sleep deprivation has been shown to increase the production of our pro-inflammatory cytokines and disrupt immune effector cell functions such as natural killer cell activity, which clearly play a very important role in a range of immune or diseases associated with immune aberration. I think something that's really important to point out about our circadian rhythm associated with sleep is that it is light sensitive, and circadian rhythms actually occur not only in people, they occur in animals, as depicted by this most beautiful lioness in the bottom left hand of my screen. Hard workers like our painter in the top left hand of my screen, and I could have put many more photos there too. But interestingly, our microbes and the microbes that inhabit both the earth and also the human microbiome also have circadian cycles and rhythms. So there is quite an interconnectedness between our cells, our sleep, and the circadian rhythms of those things around us. Stephen, are you able to move to the next slide? Thank you. So just briefly touching on some of the evidence around promoting sleep health behaviours. So encouraging patients and indeed ourselves to keep the same sleep schedule every day. So meaning going to bed and getting up at the same time. The common myth about trying to catch up on sleep appears to be counterproductive. So if we find ourselves having less sleep one night, you can't make up for it the following night. It isn't a banking system with sleep. It is better for people to get through that day and go to sleep at a normal scheduled time in order to keep this circadian rhythm functioning. I've put here on this third bullet point about avoiding overexposure to COVID-19 news. And perhaps limiting this to less than 3 hours per day. Now, I've taken this bullet point from a very learned colleague of mine, Professor Bandana Sayani, who's actually written this article for doctors and pharmacists involved in the front line, where they've been looking at their sleep behaviours and finding that the exposure to news around COVID has a significant disruption on the sleep. And I think we could probably extrapolate this to most people on the earth with the amount of media that we are being exposed to. And of course, avoiding our large meals or heavy exercise close to bedtime as well. Now, the next point here about avoiding caffeine, I mean, I think most of us are aware of the stimulatory effect of caffeine. The Sleep Health Foundation actually make recommendations to the general public of that being less than not having it 2 hours before bed. But there is some literature to suggest that in sensitive people, even 5 to 6 hours before bed can have a disruptive effect. And when it comes to alcohol, we know that, as Stephen shared, that we're seeing a 20% increase in the amount of alcohol that's been consumed by Australians at this time. We know people are drinking earlier in the day, and in relation to sleep, we know that it tends to fragment sleep rather than consolidate it. So in regards to some of the mind-body practices, could talk for many more minutes, perhaps hours, about the impact of mind-body practices on a range of physiological systems in the human body. But we do know that these do help promote good sleep. And I've referred to the app here called The Smiling Mind, which is supported or endorsed by the Sleep Health Foundation. And I encourage you to have a look at that app. It has a broad variety of exercises to suit individual preferences around some mind-body practices to help improve sleep. And then my final point there was about building a strong association between bed and sleep. So there is two particular types of exercises that can be done, one called stimulus control and the second one called time and bed restriction. Now, due to the fact that we have another speaker and we also want to have time for discussion, I'm not going to go into details about the methodology in both those interventions, but they can be found in my reference list in the Sleep Health Foundation link. So I encourage you to look at those because they are interesting and they are evidence-based. If we could please move to the next slide, Stephen. So just briefly on exercise and immunity. So I've looked at a lot of literature around this over the past couple of days whilst preparing for this webinar. And essentially, this paper by Simpson, which I have a quote from, is an excellent debate about the evidence to support its benefits on the function of the immune system and resistance to infection, and also the suppressive effects. And really the bottom line is too much of a good thing can have a suppressing effect. So the evidence would suggest that exercise moderate to vigorous intensity for 45 minutes a day in healthy individuals or normally healthy individuals will reduce the risk of respiratory infections. However, high intensity or greater than 2 hours of exercise or for extended periods of time has been shown to have these immune suppressive effects. So then further looking at this within the context of two factors, one, chronic disease. There is an excellent resource that I would suggest all healthcare professionals become familiar with, and this is the Exercises Medicine website. It's a global initiative by the American College of Sports Medicine. In Australia, it's managed by Exercise and Sports Science Australia. And what that has in there is fact sheets for both the public, but it also has fact sheets for health professionals around making specialised or prescription type exercises for people with particular disease states. So as any healthcare professional in our virtual audience tonight will know, just telling somebody to exercise for 45 minutes a day isn't terribly helpful, that they will often need specific guidance and precautions depending on the chronic health disease that they may be living with. So there's some great guides there, and also obviously extending that integrative health approach to including healthcare professionals such as exercise scientists and physiologists who may be practicing and consulting into the team looking after a particular person. Then funneling down into the context of COVID, there are some obvious practicalities around exercise. Obviously, with many gymnasiums and other exercise facilities, people like to exercise them with physical distancing, also running past people in close proximity, and all those things need to be considered. But also the paper that I'm citing here has some interesting arguments about when should somebody return to exercise after they have had a COVID or have been diagnosed with COVID because of the potential cardiac complications with inflammation of the cardiac muscle in response to the viral infection. So these things need to be considered carefully and looked at. But if we go back to health promoting behaviours, as a general rule, in most healthy people, 45 minutes of regular exercise will have a health promoting effect. And I don't think I have another slide, do I, Stephen?
No, thanks. So you've got a slide which will go to the people who want the slides with all your references. Thanks, Joe. And last, we've got Dr. Nikki Bailey talking to us about the practicalities of pandemic practice. Nikki.
Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to join you. I'm a doctor and herbalist in Auckland, New Zealand, and I'm going to share some of my thoughts and experiences around the practical side of being a herbalist in this pandemic. In New Zealand, we were given 48 hours notice before going into one of the strictest lockdowns in the world. What does that mean? Well, we're becoming a very shaggy nation because we can't get near a hairdresser for at least 2 or 3 months. No coffee, not even takeaway coffee, no water activity, not even swims at the local beach. But this stuff is not important. What matters is we have, by the looks of it, eliminated community transmission of COVID-19, which is a great achievement. What does it mean for herbalists and naturopaths? We were told only essential services could work, and herbalists and naturopaths were not considered essential. So we were told to stay at home and save lives. So some of us can work from home, but the blow for herbalists and naturopaths was also we were not able to dispense medicines to our clients. We were not allowed to use couriers or delivery services. So it's been quite a challenging time, and there have been ways around that. There was also a scarcity of a lot of our favourite immune supporting herbs and supplements. And what's happened for me over this time, and maybe many of you also, has been a reminder of how vulnerable we are as countries relying on global production and global supply chains for much of what we use. So it's made me think, with the uncertain future ahead, how can I support my patients with what we can access locally in the kitchen, in the backyard, in the gardens, even in the supermarket? So that's been one of the challenges. The novel nature of COVID-19, which Stephen's referred to, we just do not know what will help change the trajectory of this illness or help prevent it. we do have a lot greater understanding about some of the herbal medicines effects in infection and inflammation. But I've been drawn to go back to the basics and think about what our forebears did supporting people with infections. They certainly had plenty of practice with this. What does that rich traditional knowledge tell us? Connection with patients and colleagues. I'm finding the intensity of all the online Zooms and Skypes and quite tiring, and maybe some of you as well. That's a challenge in this time. And of course, stress, emotional, loved ones not being able to be with family as they die, not having funerals, the financial stresses, both as practitioners and our patients maybe not being able to afford our services as well. So going on to the next slide, what's our role as herbalists and naturopaths in this pandemic? Stephen, if you can just move the slide on, it'd be great. I've certainly found, for me, a lot has been supporting my patients with health issues related to the lockdowns. So a patient with recurrent depression now in lockdown in his apartment with a flatmate he doesn't get on with, noticing his mood is dropping, he's not motivated to exercise. A parent with a 10-year-old boy with severe asthma, scared of sending him back to school, asking what she can do to help support his immune system. As far as COVID-19 goes, many of us probably won't see a patient with COVID-19. The levels are very low in both our countries, which is a great thing. And as far as the support, herbal and naturopathic support, our role, if we do, is probably more with people with mild or moderate COVID, managing it at home. I don't really see our role as tending to people with severe COVID-19. They will be in hospitals or ICUs. I do want to say I think one of the most promising integrative treatments in this area is IV vitamin C, and I work in the largest IVC clinic in New Zealand. And there is some interesting, promising research coming out in the area of IVC and sepsis, and also a study going on in China at the moment with COVID-19 and IVC, but that won't be out until September. However, access is an issue. My clinic in New Zealand is closed through these lockdown times. Accessing IVC in the hospitals in New Zealand is very difficult. There's very few ICU units that will give IVC to patients with sepsis or severe infection. So hopefully as these studies come out, if they're positive, things will change around that. And the other area I've been thinking about a lot is supporting the elderly and vulnerable populations. Most of the deaths in New Zealand have been from 2 rest homes. And the rest homes are a really highly vulnerable population. So how do we support our elderly people? I've had some first-hand experience of this. My 86-year-old mother-in-law from Dublin, Ireland, came to visit us in February, was due to fly out in April, and is now stranded in New Zealand, which she's quite happy about. Much safer for her to be here than in Ireland. And she's got quite a traditional diet for her age group. She loves tea, always with biscuits. She loves toast with butter and very well-cooked vegetables. So I've been trying to find ways to improve her immune function and resilience, and just little things like getting her to put honey on her porridge instead of sugar. She won't have teas or tinctures or bitter foods. I've been making veggie juices with beetroot and celery and greens from the garden and lots of ginger, trying to put berries in her porridge for the anthocyanins. And I think about how can we get more of this into the rest homes, the retirement communities, support our patients and their families and parents and vulnerable people. So that's quite a practical thing. Maybe we can look at more with education and ways to do that. So the next slide, just a little bit about what we can offer while staying local, what's around us that we can access easily. And some of the other speakers have covered this. I'll just mention a few things. The bitters, which have a very subtle but profound effect on our digestive health, and a part of most traditional cultures around the world. And there's a fabulous chapter on bitters Guido Massey has written, which I'd highly recommend if anyone wants to look into that more. That's M-A-S-E, Guido Massey, I think you say it, or Mace. The antioxidants, just rosemary, sage, thyme, grow in a lot of our gardens, easily accessible, very high in antioxidants like rosmarinic acid, carnosol. New Zealand black currants have been shown to have 30 times the amount of vitamin C as blueberries and 4 times the level of anthocyanins. So really rich in these antioxidants. Elderberries, I'll talk a little bit about on the next slide. Rose hips as well. My colleague and teacher Isla Burgess has just released a very practical book on making some of these elderberry, berry, anthocyanin-rich syrups. Great practical tips for increasing antioxidants. Ginger, turmeric's been discussed. Onion, garlic, again, traditionally used right back to 5,000 years ago, these records of garlic being eaten. Evenly, the Egyptian workers working on the pyramids went on strike because they didn't have enough onion and garlic in their foods. And the Turks, when they were invading Europe, the two things they had the biggest supply of were garlic and coffee. So a very respected and valued plant. Medicinal mushrooms, some of which do grow locally in New Zealand. I'm not sure about Australia, I'm sure they do. And chamomile for the digestive effect, but also just the anxiety and stress around this time, safe from babies through to elderly people. And then my last slide, if we are supporting people with COVID-19 at home, what might be possible for them to take that may just help their resilience, their immunity, and help them to recover? And as everyone said, we don't have any evidence in terms of the scientific support for this, but they're all very, very old traditional remedies. Onion, garlic, manuka honey, which is a mix that can be made up and taken by kids. It's a way to get onion and garlic into them. Manuka carnica, which has some antimicrobial effects and can be made into a tea. They're native New Zealand plants. Elderflower, elderberry. Elderflower used traditionally for supporting fevers, diaphoretic, and elderberry, a long tradition of use called the medicine chest of herbs, the elder tree. And I'll come back to that just a little bit around the inflammation sort of discussion that's come up. And then some of the herbs that can be used for expectorant, chesty coughs, nasal congestion, thyme, which is widely available, elecampane, kumarahau. In that picture, the little fluffy flower is a New Zealand native kumarahau, which is a prized herb for lung conditions and lung inflammation. Fenugreek and calendula Ren's mentioned. And then some of the demulcent herbs, very soothing for the respiratory tract, mullein, which grows wild in New Zealand, marshmallow, plantain, the linseed slurry, the liquid from soaked linseed, holheria, and vitamin C as well. And just coming back to elderberry, I just want to make a comment on the information going around that I'm sure some of you have read that elderberry can worsen inflammation or cause a cytokine storm. And just thinking about this quite a bit and just offering my views on it, and I'm welcome, other people might challenge this or a different idea. But looking at that inflammation and what causes inflammation and infection, the inflammation is caused by our own tissues. So the virus invading our tissues, sending out messages that pulls the immune system in, and it's like little fires that start burning to try and clear the virus, causing the sore throat, the peppery nose, the burning sinuses, and if it progresses, then some lung inflammation and maybe systemic symptoms like a fever. And if our immune system can't get on top of it, that fire will spread and it will get stronger. And there's a turning point where it becomes more like a raging inferno, like an Australian bushfire that's out of control. And that's what we call the cytokine storm. And then it is our own inflammation that is doing the damage and damaging our organs, and in some cases resulting in death. Herbs are not blowtorches, they're not bombs. There are some potent herbs. I'm not saying there aren't some that can't do damage, but most of the herbs we use, I think, are more like a nudge, like Simon Mills calls the nudge. They nudge our systems. So I would liken, given something like elderberry, at the point there is marked inflammation, like throwing a match into a bushfire. I don't think it's going to worsen inflammation. It's not going to help it either. And I agree with Stephen's comments that anything that stimulates the immune system is just not indicated once the immune system is overactive. So very useful in the beginning, in the first few days of an infection. But I also, my senses and my clinical experience with this is things like elderberry are not likely to worsen inflammation and certainly not cause a cytokine storm. I think that's a reaction to our own tissues, that extreme distress signal they're sending out. So I guess just to summarise, I just wanted to share my thoughts around some of those issues around accessing herbs, using local supplies, and perhaps this pandemic will also inspire us to look at growing more of our herbs locally and developing that industry, for which there's a lot of potential, I'm sure, in both our countries. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Nikki. We've got time for some questions. We had some in advance of the seminar. Fiona McCormack said that given that older people are more at risk of severe disease and death, should they contract COVID-19? And given the diminishing diversity of our microbiomes as we age, I would like the panelists to discuss the role of gut and respiratory microbiome diversity in disease severity. Is any work being done on this? If so, references please. And she notes that she keeps on searching for them. Jo, have you got any thoughts?
Yeah, there's well, I'll answer the question in two parts. So we know there is a relationship between the health and well-being of our elderly people and the composition of their microbiome. And there was a brilliant paper written and published in Nature in 2012 that looked at the differences between people in elderly people in a care home and those who are independently living. And they looked at the differences between the composition of their microbiome. If I remember correctly, it was about 175 elderly people. And what they identified was that those who were out and independently living, who were eating more fruit and vegetables, fresh fruit and vegetables, had greater diversity and a composition that was favourable to a number of conditions that we know are associated with the composition of the microbiome. So I'm very happy to share that reference with you. And I guess what's also really important to point out is there is an abundance now of evidence to show that plant-based diets or plant-dominant diets do create a far more diverse composition within the gut microbiome. So I think to answer your question, yes, there is evidence to show that the composition of the microbiome in the elderly will improve their health and well-being, including immunity.
And one of the take-home messages that I heard you say is that the greater the diversity of fruits and vegetables they eat, or the greater the amount, the healthier their microbiome is going to be. And interestingly enough, you know, work done by Australia's Mark Valquist demonstrated the more diversity that elderly people have in their diets, the less chronic diseases that they're actually likely to have. So I think it just follows that You know, the classic thing of the little old lady eating tea and toast as a diet is not going to be supportive of well-being. We have to encourage our elderly people to actually maintain a richly diverse diet and not get into food ruts. You know, not have, you know, the same cereal for breakfast, the same sandwich for lunch, and have 1 or 2 different evening meals. They need to have a much greater diversity in their diet.
And it was also related to the fibre content of that diet, you know, from not just fruit and vegetables, but other plants as well, with soluble and insoluble fibres, acting as prebiotics for the growth of some of these indigenous bacteria that we know play an essential role in mediating and modulating immune function.
Fantastic, thanks, Jo. Fiona's second question was related to the cytokine storm that occurs in severe disease. What do we know about the naturopathic prevention mitigation? And would you recommend an anti-inflammatory diet, brackets lifestyle, and herbs as prophylaxis and treatment?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a given. And I think this idea of, you know, herbs inducing the cytokine storm, I think, Nikki, you summed that up really nicely. I feel like the discussion around using herbs and the cytokine storm are quite mute. But I feel like in the case with this pathogen, where I don't think our standard antivirals are going to cut the mustard. I think we need to be thinking more along the lines of supporting metabolic integrity, and once again supporting that barrier immunity. So I feel like, you know, just doing your standard antiviral treatment, from everything I'm reading, it's not necessarily going to work. I don't know if that answers the question.
One of the other things that personally, you know, I would actually do if I was to catch COVID-19 was to actually significantly increase my consumption of wakame seaweed, or wakame seaweed, Undaria pinnafatida. And one of the reasons for that is that, you know, I've done research on it that's actually demonstrated it's got potent anti-inflammatory effects. It's also got some immune modulating effects. But a colleague of mine is just about to have a paper published in Marine Drugs where they did a mouse model looking at influenza-induced pneumonia, and they found that mice actually fed wakame as part of their diet actually had significantly less lung consolidation than mice that didn't. And given the fact that it's potently anti-inflammatory, and we demonstrated and published that in humans, it's one of those things that I'd actually be doing. I'd also, you know, be doing the sorts of things that I talked about. I'd making sure that my diet was as pristine as possible, that I was consuming lots of those sort of anthocyanin-rich foods. Agree completely with Nikki about the sorts of approaches that utilize, you know, a range of therapeutic herbs and vitamin C and zinc. And in the early stages, I think vitamin D is important, and I'd primarily probably be trying to do that by going out and getting some sun on a regular basis, and maybe doing some supplementation if I couldn't. One of the things that I think is interesting, and, you know, a question that I would want to actually ask the panel, and I did the other day, is, you know, I am constantly asked at the moment, should I be taking echinacea or andrographis or an immune stimulating herb daily? Any thoughts?
Yeah, well, I like that discussion we had, and that I don't think immune stimulating is where we need to go. I think immune modulating and supporting cellular integrity. But I think I like that discussion we had, Stephen, around maybe 1 day a week, maybe Monday we take a little bit of echinacea or andrographis, but certainly not 7 days a week, mainly just due to the change that it'll have on the microbiota. They are herbs, but they are strong and they do alter the environment. So I think they've got their place short-term up front in the infection. But I think there's better agents. I think we can do a lot more with diet. And I just want to put out there about nose breathing. We haven't touched on that yet, and I can see there's a few questions, but I'll let you answer a bit, Nikki, before we move
Yeah, there's two ways that I'd use the herbs like echinacea and andrographis. One is at the very start of an infection, so the very first sign of infection, taking quite a high dose just for a few days. And I have patients that won't be without andrographis, echinacea, sacred basil mixes on their shelf to use in that sort of situation, because in some cases it can stop the infection developing or shorten the course, not always, but that's for a few days. The other way is if someone is run down or travelling or exposed to infection a bit more, to take it as a preventive, again for a few days or a week or two. But yeah, my approach would probably be similar, I think, to Stephen and Ren, just taking it for short term as needed rather than long term.
Yeah, and I might just jump in there as well, just to one, agree that we're talking about short-term use, and that's how these herbs have traditionally been used. And the new trend towards taking a particular immune herbal mix for the duration of winter every year, we simply really just don't know what those effects are. And another PhD student of mine is actually looking at that. What is the effect of taking echinacea and andrographis over a longer term period on the composition of the microbiome and also immune markers? So I think it's an answer we actually don't know in terms of the science, but if we look back at the tradition was short term use in acute settings. And then I think we also need to bring this into the context of what's on everybody's mind is COVID. What we're all talking about here is upper respiratory tract infections. We're not talking about COVID-19 because we don't know. And I think that's a really important point. We don't know how this virus would respond to those herbs at this point, apart from some theoretical studies that have been put forward at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the thing that I'd like to bring to bear in this discussion about immune stimulants is common sense. And one of the things that we actually know with anything is if we stimulate and stimulate and stimulate and stimulate, you overstimulate and you then downregulate. And it makes sense to me to do exactly what Nikki's suggesting, which is to come in, right at the start of something, take things that prime and get the immune system working, and then actually allow the body to do the rest of the job. One of the things that I'm doing, because I'm in an at-risk group, is that I'm doing what Ren suggested and having Immune Mondays. I take an immune stimulant once a week, just really to keep my immune system primed, but I don't want to overstimulate it. We had a question while we're actually talking about that from Leslie Braun, the director of the Blackmores Institute, saying that the Andy Weil paper suggests not using immune activating agents due to concern about a cytokine storm aggravation. What are your thoughts? And this is purely theoretical, and I have doubts that our herbs are powerful enough to pose a clinically significant risk. What do you think? Well, I guess, the thing that I'm immediately aware of is that, phytolactic decandra, pokeroot mudgeon is actually used classically as one of the major stimulants of immune function in macrophages. So our classical herbs actually are amazingly potent immune stimulants. And I have no doubt that they can actually do that in a clinical setting as well. The thing that I think we need to be aware of is that some things actually stimulate cytokines potentially in a beneficial way, like medicinal mushrooms, that taken at the start of something can actually assist the body in its own immune response. But at other times, you want to actually downregulate those cytokines, and there are other substances that might do that. And, one of the ones that I'm aware of is, green lip mussel oil, for instance, or any of the beneficial marine lipids often have downregulating effects on those cytokines. So we need to actually balance the stimulation versus the inhibition during various phases of an infection.
And Stephen, maybe if I can come in there, I sort of addressed this a little bit in my talk, but also looking down to where that information comes from. And If you look at elderberry, for instance, my understanding is the concern about it increasing inflammation was based on a 2001 study, a randomised controlled trial of people with the flu, showing that it actually reduced flu duration by 3 to 4 days. But in the convalescent phase serum, the antibody level was higher and there was enhancement of pro-inflammatory cytokines. Even though the people got better more quickly, there was no mention of it triggering a cytokine storm or severe inflammation. But then sometimes that information is picked up and then broadened from where it came from, and some assumptions are made that elderberry causes inflammation or increases inflammation or can trigger a cytokine storm. So it's also looking at where these things come from, and I think having some discussion or critical review of that as well.
And I might just jump in. Oops, sorry, that was distorted. I might just jump in there, you know, to add that the general community are still going to buy and use these herbs, and the more that they can come to healthcare practitioners and healthcare practitioners take that sensible approach that Stephen's talking about, just using common sense and having a sensible discussion about that short-term use, I think all the better for the community.
Okay, I'm aware that we're over time, and so thank you for those people who are persisting with us. During the time that I had the slides up, I wasn't able to see the chat, and we've literally got, you know, possibly 100 questions. We still haven't actually even got through the ones that we pre-did, so I'm asking for some advice from the AIMA admin about how they would like us to proceed. One of the questions that came from Thalicia said, I've heard that vitamin C can be taken orally daily to boost our immunity. Is taking too much going to damage the liver? Nikki, would you like to have a shot at that?
Yeah, there's no evidence or experience I've seen of oral vitamin C or IV vitamin C damaging the liver. The area that there's a few case reports are vitamin C possible links with acute kidney injury or a type of nephropathy, oxalate nephropathy. All of those cases had other factors, comorbidity, so it's hard to see exactly the link with vitamin C, but that's the only area there is some case reports out there, but no evidence I know of that it can affect the liver or be harmful to the liver. It's a very sort of non-toxic, safe supplement, and as Ren said, if you have too much, you'll just get diarrhea.
Yeah, it's not easy for the body to absorb vitamin C. We pretty much just pass it through, so it's hard to get poisoning from it. We just get diarrhea.
Yeah.
It's renally excreted relatively quickly, so your plasma peaks of vitamin C occur within 2 hours, and they actually return to normal very shortly thereafter. So any benefits are really from these peaks, which supports the concept of, if people are going to use vitamin C, it's better to have smaller doses throughout a day than larger doses more widely spaced.
And one of the things that's actually interesting is if you read the Cochrane review of vitamin C in the common cold, even after reviewing all of the evidence, and coming to the conclusion that the evidence is not strong enough yet, they say that individuals may actually be a benefit from taking vitamin C. So there's enough data there that Cochrane actually needed to provide a caveat to say that they think that there are subgroups in the population who are going to actually do significantly better if they choose to take vitamin C during the common cold. You know, again, just using common sense, I believe it is an incredibly safe substance. It plays such a major physiological role in literally, you know, countless amounts of processes that it's very benign in terms of the body. I remember Dr. Archie Kalakarinas, a general practitioner who did a lot of work with Indigenous people, probably 20 years ago, saying that he gave very large bolus doses of vitamin C to his Indigenous patients, often who had significant renal disease, without any significant impairment at a clinical level. So I think it's actually a very safe substance in general, and one that is worthwhile for people to utilise clinically, but also one of those things that we need to be aware of during the prevention stage. One of the best ways of getting it is to actually eat a diet, rich in leafy green vegetables and things like capsicum and fruits and various other things that are vitamin C rich.
Yeah, and I just throwing in some figures there because I like figures that as the doses increase of vitamin C, so does the absorption actually decreases. So approximately 87% of a 30 milligram oral dose is absorbed, whereas only 63% of a 500 milligram dose is absorbed. So you can, and this goes down incrementally. So I think that's a sort of an important take home, that if people are supplementing in addition to diet, which is the most bioavailable form, that it is the doses are considered carefully.
So the panel has more questions than we can actually answer, and I've communicated to the AIMA admin that they may want to consider actually having us back to answer all of the questions in a question and answer session at some stage. But I'll hand over to Cressida to bring tonight to a close.